Picture this. It's 3 in the morning in Glasgow, 1978. A young woman walks home alone through empty streets, her footsteps echoing off wet cobblestones. She hears something behind her, a wet grunting sound like an animal in pain. She turns. There, half hidden in the shadows between streetlights, stands a figure, a man. But something is terribly wrong with him. His body jerks and twitches as if controlled by invisible strings. His face is frozen in an expression of absolute agony, mouth twisted into a grotesque grimace. He takes a step toward her and she runs. She runs like hell. When she finally reaches home and locks the door behind her, she calls the police with trembling hands. They ask her to describe what she saw. She can barely get the words out. His face, she whispers. God help me, his face. This is just one encounter with what locals would come to call the Gurning Man. But to understand why this entity terrorized Glasgow so effectively, you need to know something important. This city has always been haunted. Glasgow is Scotland's largest city, a sprawling industrial metropolis where the River Clyde cuts through districts that have witnessed centuries of darkness. This isn't Edinburgh with its tourist-friendly ghost tours and sanitized legends. Glasgow's supernatural history is raw, more visceral, more dangerous. The city's position as Scotland's major port brought workers and immigrants from across the world, and with them came their nightmares. Irish legends mixed with Highland folklore, Eastern European superstitions blended with local ghost stories, creating something unique and deeply unsettling. The people here don't just tell ghost stories, they live with them. Ask any Glaswegian over 50 about the kelpies that lurk in the city's waterways, shape-shifting water demons that appear as beautiful horses, luring victims to climb on their backs before dragging them to a drowning death. They'll tell you these aren't fairy tales. They'll tell you about Uncle Robert, who went fishing one night and never came home, his empty boat found drifting near the reeds. They'll tell you about the phantom armies of dead soldiers that rise from mass graves to fight eternal battles in the fog. Some will even lower their voices and mention Jenny with the iron teeth, a female ghoul who crawls through bedroom windows to devour sleeping children. But the incident that best captures Glasgow's relationship with the supernatural happened in September 1954, and it involved an army of children hunting a vampire. The southern necropolis, a vast graveyard in the Gorbals district dating back to the 1600s, became the site of one of the strangest police calls in Scottish history. Officers arrived to find approximately 200 schoolchildren, armed with kitchen knives and sharpened stakes, stalking between tombstones in the gathering dusk. They were hunting for a vampire with metal teeth that had supposedly killed 2 of their classmates. Every few minutes, one of the children would spot a dark shape moving through the sulfurous smoke from nearby steelworks, and the entire mob would charge forward, screaming, weapons raised. It took police hours to disperse them, and when they did, officers searched every inch of that cemetery. They found nothing. No vampire, no bodies, no evidence of anything supernatural at all. The authorities blamed American horror comics. Mass hysteria, they said. Overactive imaginations. But the people of Glasgow knew better, because the stories the children were acting on weren't new. The legend of the Iron Man, a metal-toothed ogre that devours travelers, has been part of Scottish folklore for centuries. These weren't ideas planted by comic books. These were warnings that had been whispered in Glasgow's dark corners for generations. What made the vampire hunt significant wasn't whether the creature was real. What mattered was that 200 children believed it so completely that they were willing to face it. Even in 1954, with electric lights and modern police and rational explanations for everything, the children of Glasgow still understood on some primal level that their city harbored genuine darkness. By the late 1970s, the Gorbals had deteriorated into one of Glasgow's most troubled areas. Massive tenement buildings loomed over narrow streets where streetlights had a tendency to flicker and die. The nearby Cross Hill district wasn't much better. These were places where fog rolled in thick from the Clyde and settled like something alive in the alleyways. Places where people learned to walk quickly after dark, to never make eye contact with strangers, to trust their instincts when something felt wrong. It was the perfect hunting ground for a predator. And in the summer of 1977, something began to appear in these streets. Something that would make grown women scream, that would send men running for their lives, that would inspire a terror far beyond anything the iron-toothed vampire ever achieved. The first official sighting happened on a warm June night. Two young women, both in their early 20s, were walking home from a party around 2 in the morning. The streets were empty, silent except for their footsteps and occasional distant sound of traffic. They were laughing about something, still buzzed from cheap wine, when one of them noticed a figure standing on the opposite side of the street. He was positioned perfectly in the gap between two streetlights, half visible in the shadows, just standing there, watching them. The women stopped walking. Something about the figure felt wrong, though they couldn't immediately say what. The way he stood, perhaps. Too still, too focused. One of them called out, "You all right there?" Her voice sounded too loud in the empty street. No response. The figure remained motionless, but they could see now that he was moving somehow. A constant, subtle motion like he was shivering or twitching, despite standing in place. "Let's just go," her friend whispered. They turned to leave. That's when they heard it. A high-pitched shriek that cut through the night like a blade, so sudden and so loud that both women jumped. They spun around to see the figure emerging from the shadows, and now they could see him clearly. An older man, maybe late 50s, completely bald, dressed head to toe in black. And his face, oh God, his face. It was locked in the most horrible grimace they had ever seen. Mouth twisted, features contorted as if frozen in the middle of a scream. His whole body was jerking and undulating, arms twitching at his sides as he moved toward them with slow, deliberate steps. He was making sounds, guttural grunts and snorts with each movement, his eyes fixed on them with an intensity that made their blood run cold. The women ran. They ran until their lungs burned, didn't stop until they reached one of their flats and locked the door. They called the police immediately, but when officers arrived to search the area, they found nothing. That was just the beginning. The police report from that June night in 1977 was filed and forgotten, dismissed as two drunk girls spooked by a homeless man. But 3 weeks later, another report came in, then another, and another, each describing the same impossible figure stalking Cross Hill's streets after midnight. The first incident occurred on a warm summer night. Two young women in their early 20s were walking home from a party around 2 a.m., laughing about something, still buzzed from cheap wine, when one of them noticed a figure standing across the street. He was positioned perfectly between two streetlights, half visible in the shadows, just standing there, watching them. Something about him felt wrong, though they couldn't say what. The way he stood, perhaps. Too still, too focused. One called out, "You all right there?" Her voice sounded too loud in the empty street. No response. The figure remained motionless, but they could see now that he was moving somehow. A constant, subtle twitching despite standing in place. "Let's just go," her friend whispered. They turned to leave. That's when they heard it. A high-pitched shriek that cut through the night like a blade, so sudden and loud that both women jumped. They spun around to see the figure emerging from the shadows, and now they could see him clearly. An older man, maybe late 50s, completely bald, dressed head to toe in black. And his face, oh God, his face. It was locked in the most horrible grimace they had ever seen, mouth twisted, features contorted as if frozen mid-scream. His whole body was jerking and undulating, arms twitching at his sides as he moved toward them with slow, deliberate steps. He was making sounds, guttural grunts and snorts with each movement, his eyes fixed on them with terrible intensity. The women ran. They ran until their lungs burned, didn't stop until they reached one of their flats and locked the door. When they called the police, officers found nothing. 3 weeks later, it happened again. Margaret McLeod, a widow who had lived in the same Cross Hill tenement for 43 years, was an early riser by habit. Her late husband had worked morning shifts at the shipyards, and decades later, her body still woke her before dawn. On this particular Tuesday morning, she rose quietly, made her way downstairs in her dressing gown, and headed to the kitchen. Every morning, Margaret collected empty milk bottles from her counter and placed them on the doorstep for the milkman who arrived around 5. It was a simple task, one she had performed thousands of times without incident. But this morning would be different. She bent down to place the bottles on the ground when she heard it. A metallic clattering sound, like someone kicking over dustbins, echoing from down the street. Margaret straightened up and squinted into the pre-dawn darkness. The street was empty, lit only by widely spaced streetlights that left pools of shadow between them. For a moment, silence. Then the sound came again, louder, closer. From behind a cluster of metal bins about 30 yards away, a tall, slender figure emerged. Even from that distance, Margaret could see that something was profoundly wrong with how it moved. The figure wasn't walking normally. It was lurching, twitching, its body jerking with each step as if experiencing electrical shocks. One of its legs struck a metal bin as it passed, sending the container clattering onto its side and rolling into the street with a crash. The figure didn't stop, didn't pause. It kept coming toward her, and now Margaret could hear the sounds it was making. Low grunting noises, almost animalistic, punctuated by wet snorting sounds. She took a step backward, her hand finding the doorframe for support. The figure was getting closer, moving faster, and in the streetlight's harsh glow, she could finally see its face. The same face. The same twisted grimace of agony and rage. The same wide, staring eyes fixed on her with frightening intensity. The same flapping arms, violent, uncontrolled movements that made his whole body seem barely held together. His pace suddenly increased. He was moving directly toward her now, his roaring growing louder, more desperate, more angry. Margaret opened her mouth to scream for help, and in that instant, he vanished. Not quickly, not slowly. He simply ceased to exist. One moment he was there, perhaps 15 feet from her doorstep, his twisted face clearly visible. The next moment there was nothing but empty street. The only sound, the gentle rolling of the knocked-over bin. Margaret stood frozen for a full minute, her heart hammering. Then she stumbled inside, slammed the door, and called the police with shaking hands. When officers arrived 20 minutes later, she was still trembling. They searched the street thoroughly. They found the knocked-over bin exactly where Margaret said it would be, but no footprints, no trace of anyone having been there. No evidence the Gurning Man had ever existed. 2 nights later, a young couple 3 streets away spotted a figure standing beneath a broken streetlight, his body moving in that same horrible twitching motion. When the man called out, the figure released a piercing shriek, and began moving toward them with jerky, puppet-like steps. The couple ran, and when they looked back, the figure had disappeared into thin air. Then came the taxi driver who swore he saw a bald man in black clothing standing in the middle of the road at 3 a.m., his face locked in a terrible grimace, his body writhing as if in pain. The driver swerved to avoid hitting him, and when he looked in his rearview mirror, the road was empty. A night shift nurse reported seeing the same figure pressed against the hospital's ground floor window at 2 a.m., his contorted face leaving fog on the glass before he faded away. A group of teenagers sneaking home after curfew encountered him in an alley and described identical details: the twitching movements, the agonized expression, the grunting sounds, and the way he seemed to disappear when they tried to run past him. By August of 1977, Cross Hill was in the grip of genuine fear. People working night shifts began traveling in groups. Women refused to walk alone after dark. Parents kept children inside once the sun went down. The police station received calls almost nightly, but officers never found anything. No suspect, no evidence, nothing. What made the reports so disturbing was their consistency. Every witness, regardless of age, gender, or background, described the same thing. A bald man in his 50s or early 60s, always dressed entirely in black, his face always contorted in that same horrible grimace, as if frozen mid-scream, his body always in constant motion, twitching and jerking even when standing still. He always made those same guttural grunting sounds. And he always appeared between 9 p.m. and 4 a.m., never during daylight, never in well-lit areas. But it was the way he moved that terrified people most. Witnesses described it as unnatural, as if his body was being controlled by something else, as if he wasn't fully in command of his own limbs. Some said it looked like he was having a continuous seizure while remaining mobile. Others described it as puppet-like, as though invisible strings were jerking him forward. One witness said it reminded him of old film footage played at the wrong speed, movements that were technically human, but wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. And then there was his ability to vanish. Not everyone saw him disappear. Some simply ran without looking back, but those who did described the same phenomenon. He wouldn't fade gradually or run away. He would simply cease to be there, as if someone had switched off a television. Here one moment, gone the next, with no transition between states. The local newspaper ran a small article about the Cross Hill Prowler in late August, interviewing several witnesses and noting the unusual number of reports. The article was buried on page 7 and treated with barely concealed skepticism, suggesting the sightings might be connected to break-ins in the area and that residents were on edge. The theory was that a criminal was deliberately frightening people, perhaps wearing some kind of mask. But that theory didn't explain the disappearances. It didn't explain why this supposed criminal never actually hurt anyone, never stole anything, never did anything except appear and terrify. And it certainly didn't explain what happened in September of 1977, when the Gurning Man stopped simply appearing on streets and started entering people's homes. The address was a modest terraced house on a quiet Cross Hill street, home to a married couple and their 2 young daughters. They were an ordinary family who had never had reason to call the police, never experienced anything unusual, never believed in ghosts or monsters or things that went bump in the night. That changed on a September evening in 1977. The mother, whose name was kept out of police records at her request, had gone to bed around 11 p.m. Her husband was beside her, already asleep and snoring softly. Their daughters, aged 7 and 9, were in their room down the hall. It was a Tuesday night, unremarkable in every way. She fell asleep quickly. What woke her wasn't a sound exactly. It was more like a feeling, that primal awareness that tells you you're being watched. She opened her eyes slowly, still half asleep, expecting to see one of her daughters standing by the bed, asking for water or complaining about a nightmare. Instead, she heard breathing, deep, raspy breathing that wasn't coming from her husband. It was close, very close. Somewhere near the foot of the bed, the air in the room had changed too, she realized. It felt colder, and there was a smell she couldn't quite identify, something like ozone mixed with damp earth, something fundamentally wrong. She lay perfectly still, her heart beginning to race, trying to convince herself it was nothing, just her imagination, just the house settling, just... A shadow unfolded from the floor at the foot of their bed. It rose slowly, taking shape in the dim orange light filtering through the curtains from the street lamp outside. As it stood to its full height, she could see it was a man. An older man, completely bald, dressed entirely in dark clothing that seemed to absorb what little light there was. His body was moving, constantly moving. His hands rubbed frantically up and down his chest, striking the sides of his torso in a rhythm that seemed both deliberate and uncontrolled. His head was tilting and swaying side to side like a cobra preparing to strike, his eyes rolling around as if he wasn't concentrating, as if he wasn't fully aware of his surroundings. The woman wanted to scream but couldn't. Her throat had closed up completely. She could only stare as this impossible figure stood at the foot of her bed, swaying and jerking, breathing that horrible raspy breath that sounded like it was being dragged through gravel. How long did she watch him? She couldn't say later. It might have been seconds. It might have been minutes. Time had stopped making sense. The figure seemed almost unaware of her presence, his movements erratic, his eyes unfocused, as if he existed in his own separate reality that only occasionally intersected with hers. Then his gaze fell upon her. His eyes locked onto hers with sudden, terrible clarity. The unfocused swaying stopped. For one frozen moment, he was completely still, and she could see his face properly for the first time. It was contorted into an expression of such profound agony and rage that it barely looked human anymore. His mouth was stretched wide, not in a scream but in a silent grimace that pulled his entire face into something nightmarish. He released a blood-curdling scream that shattered the silence like glass. The sound was inhuman, a mixture of rage and pain, and something else, something that bypassed her conscious mind and went straight to the most primitive part of her brain that still remembered being prey. As the scream echoed through the bedroom, the figure suddenly lunged forward across the bed toward her, his fingers reaching out, his body writhing with each movement. Her husband sat bolt upright with a shout and fumbled for the bedside lamp. His hand found the switch. Light spilled across the room. The figure was gone. One moment, the hissing, snarling thing was reaching for her, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from where he should have been. The next moment, he had simply melted away the instant the light touched him, as if he had never been there at all. Her husband leaped out of bed and checked the room, then rushed to check on their daughters. Both girls were sound asleep, undisturbed. He checked every window, every door. All were locked from the inside, exactly as he had secured them before bed. There was no way anyone could have entered the house, and certainly no way they could have left while locking everything behind them. The police arrived within 15 minutes. They searched the house top to bottom, checked the garden, interviewed the neighbors. Nothing. No footprints in the flower beds beneath the windows, no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been in that bedroom except the couple themselves. But the woman knew what she had seen. She could still feel those eyes on her, could still hear that terrible scream echoing in her head. For weeks afterwards, she couldn't sleep without every light in the house blazing. 3 weeks later, it happened again. Different house, different family, but the same nightmare. The Henderson family lived 4 streets away in a narrow townhouse with their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, aged between 6 and 11. Michael Henderson worked night shifts at a printing press and typically arrived home around 6 a.m. On this particular morning in early October, he returned to find his wife sitting at the kitchen table, chain smoking with shaking hands, all the lights in the house burning despite the dawn breaking outside. The children, she told him, had all woken up screaming at exactly 2:47 a.m. Mrs. Henderson had been jolted from sleep by the sound of her youngest son shrieking in terror. She threw off the covers and ran to his room, her husband's absence meaning she was alone and dealing with whatever had frightened him. But before she reached his door, her daughter's scream joined her brother's. Then, the oldest boy, all 3 children in 3 separate rooms, screaming as if they were being murdered. She found her youngest first, sitting up in bed, eyes wide with terror, pointing at the corner of his room near the wardrobe. "The man," he kept saying. "The man with the angry face. He was watching me sleep." Her daughter was in a similar state, gasping about a bald man in black who had been standing at the foot of her bed, his body shaking like he was cold, his face frozen in the scariest expression she'd ever seen. The oldest boy, trying to be brave but failing, described the same figure appearing beside his bed, so close he could hear the wet, grunting sounds coming from the man's throat. Mrs. Henderson had searched every room, every closet, under every bed. She checked all the doors and windows. Everything was locked. She found nothing. But all 3 children described exactly the same person, down to the smallest details. The bald head, the black clothes, the horrible grimacing face, the constant unsettling movements, the guttural sounds. And they all said the same thing about how he disappeared. One moment he was there, solid and terrifying. The next moment, when they screamed or reached for their bedside lamps, he simply wasn't. No running away, no hiding, just gone, as if he'd been erased. Michael Henderson called the police despite his wife's protests that they'd think she was crazy. The responding officers were the same ones who had investigated the bedroom incident 3 weeks earlier. When they heard the description, they exchanged glances. They took statements from all 3 children separately. The stories matched perfectly. Too perfectly for it to be something the kids had made up together. The oldest boy, trying not to cry, told the officers something that made them pause. "His eyes were wrong," he said. "Like he was looking at me, but also looking through me. Like I wasn't really there. Like he couldn't quite see me properly. And he smelled weird. Like when you open a window during a thunderstorm." After the police left, the Henderson family didn't sleep for the rest of that night. Mrs. Henderson sat in the hallway between all 3 children's rooms with a cricket bat across her lap until dawn. The next day, they started looking for a new place to live. Over the following months, 4 more families reported similar intrusions. The pattern was always the same. The figure appeared inside locked homes between midnight and 4 a.m., always in bedrooms, always watching people sleep. He never spoke, never attempted to steal anything, never tried to physically harm anyone. But his mere presence, that contorted face and jerking body, and those wet animal sounds, was enough to traumatize families so completely that several moved out of Cross Hill entirely. An elderly widower woke to find the Gurning Man standing inches from his face, so close the old man could see the pores in his skin, could count the wrinkles around his eyes. The figure was shaking violently, hands clawing at his own chest as if trying to tear something out of himself. When the old man gasped and reached for his glasses, the figure vanished like smoke. A young woman living alone reported waking to the sound of breathing in her room and the overwhelming smell of electrical burning. She opened her eyes to see him crouched in the corner like an animal, rocking back and forth, making those horrible grunting sounds. She screamed and threw her alarm clock at him. It passed through empty air and smashed against the wall. By March of 1978, 17 separate incidents had been reported across Cross Hill. 17 families whose lives had been permanently marked by those few moments when the Gurning Man had violated the safety of their homes, the sanctuary of their bedrooms. And then, just as suddenly as the appearances had begun, they stopped. The last confirmed sighting occurred on March the 23rd, 1978. After that, nothing. The Gurning Man simply vanished from Cross Hill as mysteriously as he had appeared. But those 17 encounters had established something important. They had created a pattern, a set of consistent details that appeared in every single report, regardless of the witness. And it was this consistency that made the Gurning Man different from typical urban legends, different from mass hysteria, different from anything that could be easily explained away. Because if he wasn't real, how did 17 separate families who didn't know each other, who lived streets apart, all describe exactly the same impossible thing? Detective Inspector James Morrison sat in his office at the Gorbals police station in April 1978, staring at 17 witness statements spread across his desk. 17 families, 17 nearly identical descriptions, all within a 2-mile radius of Cross Hill, all between the hours of 9 p.m. and 4 a.m. In his 23 years on the force, Morrison had seen plenty of strange things. Glasgow was that kind of city, but this was different. This bothered him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He picked up the statement from Margaret MacLeod, the elderly woman who'd encountered the figure by the bins. Her description was precise, detailed, unwavering even under repeated questioning. Then he compared it to the statement from the young mother whose bedroom had been invaded 3 months later. Different witnesses, different locations, different circumstances. Identical descriptions down to the smallest details. Morrison had investigated mass hysteria before. The Gorbals vampire incident of 1954 was still taught at the police academy as a textbook case, but this wasn't mass hysteria. Mass hysteria was emotional, chaotic, inconsistent. This was the opposite. This was 17 separate people, most of whom had never met, all describing the same impossible thing with disturbing precision. He'd brought in Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a neurologist from Glasgow Royal Infirmary, to review the witness descriptions. She sat across from his desk now, reading through the statements with a deepening frown. "The movements they're describing," she said finally, tapping one of the papers. "Huntington's disease could cause something similar. So could severe tardive dyskinesia, or advanced Parkinson's with dyskinesia. The facial contortions sound like dystonia, involuntary muscle contractions. So it could be a real person, someone who's ill." Dr. Chen set down the statement. "Could be. But Inspector, someone that's severely affected wouldn't be mobile. They certainly wouldn't be breaking into homes, evading police, disappearing without trace. And these conditions don't cause people to vanish into thin air when lights come on." Morrison nodded slowly. He'd thought the same thing. "What about the smell several witnesses mentioned? The ozone and electrical burning?" "That's interesting, actually. Some people with temporal lobe epilepsy report smelling ozone or burning before seizures. But the witnesses aren't the ones having seizures. They're smelling something coming from him. She paused. There's another possibility. Ozone is produced by electrical discharges, lightning, for instance. Some paranormal researchers claim unusual smells accompany supernatural events, particularly ozone. You're saying he's a ghost. I'm saying I can't explain this medically. Dr. Chen gathered her things. But I can tell you what he's not. He's not a normal human being suffering from a movement disorder. Whatever these people saw, it wasn't that. After she left, Morrison pulled out another file. This one contained historical records he'd requested from the city archives. Deaths in Cross Hill going back 100 years. He'd been looking for a pattern, some tragic event that might have created a restless spirit. The area had its share of darkness. A tenement fire in 1923 that killed 11 people. Several suicides over the decades. A murder-suicide in 1965. Industrial accidents at the nearby factories, but nothing that seemed to match. No bald man in his 50s dying in particularly agonizing circumstances that might explain the twisted grimace frozen on the Gurning Man's face. Morrison's partner, Sergeant David Ross, had a different theory. He'd been researching similar cases from other parts of the world and had found something unsettling. "Sir, look at this." Ross spread photographs and documents across Morrison's desk. West Virginia, 1966. Multiple witnesses reported encounters with an entity they called Indrid Cold, also known as the Grinning Man. Tall, muscular build, completely bald, enlarged facial features frozen in an unnatural expression. He appeared and disappeared mysteriously, seemed to have difficulty fully interacting with witnesses, left people deeply disturbed by the wrongness of his presence. Morrison studied the documents. The similarities were striking. Cold claimed to be extraterrestrial, Ross continued. But look at how witnesses described his movements, like he was struggling to exist in our space, like his body wasn't quite synchronized with reality. Sound familiar? You think our man is an alien? I think he might be something that doesn't belong here. Not a ghost, not a living person. Something else. Something that's slipping through from somewhere else, and the process is causing him pain. That's why his face is locked in that expression. That's why he moves like his body's fighting itself. He's being torn between two places. Morrison wanted to dismiss it as nonsense, but he couldn't, because it explained things the other theories didn't. It explained why the Gurning Man seemed to look through witnesses rather than at them, as if they existed in realities that only occasionally overlapped. It explained why light dispelled him, if a sudden bright light disrupted whatever tenuous connection allowed him to manifest. It explained how he entered locked rooms. "There's something else, sir," Ross said quietly. "All the home intrusions stopped on March 23rd. That was the spring equinox. Some researchers believe dimensional boundaries are thinner during equinoxes and solstices. What if whatever was pulling him through closed? What if he's stuck somewhere between worlds?" Morrison didn't sleep well that night. He kept thinking about the Henderson children, all three waking up screaming at the exact same moment, all describing the same figure watching them sleep. He thought about the young mother who still couldn't sleep without every light in her house blazing. He thought about Margaret McLeod's statement. "His eyes were wrong, Inspector. Like he was looking at me, but seeing something else entirely." The official report Morrison filed listed the incidents as unexplained but likely related to a disturbed individual who has since left the area. It was the safest conclusion, the one that wouldn't make him look crazy, the one that would let people sleep at night. But in his private notes, the ones he kept in his locked desk drawer, Morrison wrote something different. Whatever the witnesses encountered, it was real to them in ways that transcend typical delusion or hysteria. The consistency of reports suggests a genuine phenomenon, the nature of which remains unknown. Traditional investigative methods have proven inadequate. Recommend monitoring for any future incidents. There was one final document in Morrison's file, a report that had come in just before the sightings stopped. A night shift worker at Queen's Park had called police about a figure he'd seen standing beneath a broken streetlight. The description matched perfectly, but when officers arrived, they found something the witness hadn't mentioned. On the ground where the figure had been standing, the grass was dead in a perfect circle about 3 feet in diameter. Just dead, as if all life had been instantly drained from it. The soil inside the circle was warm to the touch, though the night was cold. Morrison had sent a sample to a laboratory. The results came back inconclusive. The soil showed unusual electromagnetic signatures that the technician couldn't explain. It's like something was generating a powerful field, the report stated. But there's no known natural process that would create this pattern. The dead grass circle was still there 3 months later when Morrison checked. Nothing would grow in that spot. He never told anyone about it. The file remained in his desk drawer until his retirement in 1995. When he died in 2003, his daughter found it among his effects and, not knowing what to make of it, donated it to the Glasgow Police Museum, along with his other papers. It sits there now, archived and mostly forgotten. 17 witness statements describing something that shouldn't exist. But sometimes, late at night when the museum is empty, the archivists say they hear sounds from the storage room where Morrison's files are kept. Wet, grunting sounds. The sound of something moving with jerky, uncontrolled motions. The sound of breathing that's wrong somehow, raspy and labored, like it's being dragged through gravel. They never investigate. They've learned not to. And in Cross Hill, in Queen's Park, in the dark streets where the Gurning Man once walked, people still see him sometimes. Not often, not predictably, but enough that the stories persist. A figure standing too still in the shadows. A twisted face pressed against a window. A dark shape that jerks and sways as it moves through the pre-dawn darkness. The witnesses don't always report it. They've learned that some things can't be explained, can't be investigated, can't be stopped. They just lock their doors, turn on their lights, and try not to think about what might be standing at the foot of their bed, watching them sleep, locked in endless agony, caught between worlds. Because the Gurning Man was never caught. He was never identified. He was never explained. And that means he could come back. He could be out there right now, in the spaces between streetlights, in the hours between midnight and dawn, his body jerking and convulsing, his face frozen in that terrible grimace, making those wet animal sounds as he searches for something, or someone, or some way back to wherever he came from. So, if you're ever in Glasgow in the early hours of the morning, and you hear metallic clattering in the distance, or smell something like ozone and electrical burning, or feel the overwhelming certainty that someone is watching you from the darkness, remember what Detective Inspector Morrison learned. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. And some things that slip through from elsewhere never find their way back. The Gurning Man is still out there, still caught between worlds, still suffering, still appearing to those unlucky enough to cross his path. And if you see him, if you wake in the night to find him standing at the foot of your bed with that horrible, twisted face, don't try to understand what he is. Don't try to communicate. Don't try to help. Just turn on the lights and pray he disappears before he decides to reach for you with those twitching, jerking hands. because no one knows what happens if he actually touches you. No one has ever lived to tell